I just finished watching the F.A.T training video, and I just wanted to reflect on some of my thoughts. And I have my notes in front of me, so that's what I'm looking at. And I'm realizing that there's like an elephant butt in the background, so just ignore that as well. I kind of looked at the Padlet, and some people said, it's generally pretty positive, and I tend to agree. There were some things that I had issues with, but I'm going to kind of reflect on some of the thoughts that I had along the way. I'm a grad student. I'm a career changer. I'm originally studied business in undergraduate, and now I'm going to become a teacher, kind of changing paths, and so I don't have a lot of teaching experience, but in the past year I've had a lot of tutoring experience, and I've tutored a couple of children who do have learning disabilities, specifically auditory processing disorder, and I think that this would have been a really useful video to have seen when I was working with her. We definitely worked it out, but I think it would have helped me understand kind of the way that she was thinking when I was tutoring her. So some things that I really liked were, obviously it's fun to kind of watch all of the different activities that he gave and kind of go through the challenge yourself. I think that it was pretty engaging. But I want to kind of touch on some of the things that he talked about that really stood out to me. So one of them, I'm looking at my notes right here, was talking about the human brain and how the human brain has two purposes. The first purpose is storage, and then the second is retrieval. So we store all of these things in our brain, and then when we need them, we can retrieve them, and we have these pathways of memory, and that's kind of how we lay down new memories and like are able to retrieve thoughts. And I just immediately thought about my grandmother when we were learning about this, when he was talking about storage and retrieval in kind of like a very literal sense. So in her last years, my grandmother suffered from some form of dementia. They're not totally sure what happened, but it wasn't Alzheimer's, but she had memory loss in her final years, and she was completely dependent on my grandfather for pretty much everything. Like, she couldn't remember, everything was frustrating, caused anxiety, and caused tension for her. Like, she couldn't unload the dishwasher because she couldn't remember where her dishes went in her kitchen or in her china cabinet, or she couldn't go anywhere by herself because she couldn't remember. She sometimes wouldn't even remember where her home phone was inside the house. So that was like a very literal example of storage and retrieval, like literally not being able to retrieve like things in your house. But I thought that was just like a really, I don't know, that really stood out to me. And then another thing that they talk about right after that is like associative tasks versus cognitive tasks. And an associative task is something that you can multitask, and a cognitive task is something you can only do one at a time. So driving and talking, for example, you can do both of those until you have to really pay attention to the road, for example. Or they did that activity where they had to tell a story, but they couldn't use any words that contain the letter N. So those turned associative tasks for the typical person into a cognitive task. And I thought that was really interesting, especially paired with kind of like the examples in the very beginning of the story when they talk about just like processing speeds, because if you've never like lived that or dealt with that, then you won't be able to understand that is the reason why the child is potentially slow to respond or lagging in their understanding or their processing. So when I was tutoring Carson, this 9th grade girl who had an auditory processing disorder, I tutored all subjects with her in 9th grade, so I learned a lot about like Roman history and kind of had to relearn chemistry and like molar mass and stuff like that. But just she reading the textbook, she could read it, like that's what they said, they could decode the words, but she wouldn't necessarily be able to like grasp what the history was until I talked it out with her. So I would kind of tell the story of the history and maybe even like draw a little image, like, okay, they were here in Greece and then they went over here and then they attacked here. So that was really I think important to hear about when they talk about, let's see, like how maybe just having some students listening on a book on tape versus reading will help like processing, kind of with that example at the very end of their booklet where they, on paper it didn't really sound, it just was gibberish, but then read aloud the words like formed an actual story of George Washington and the cherry tree. I guess like the biggest critique that I had of this training video was at the very end. They called the people that had been in attendance at the workshop survivors, and I just didn't think that that was the best or most sensitive like term, or they could have probably used something just like attendees would have been a better word, you know, just saying like, oh, the people who survived having a learning disability for like 2 hours, how hard it was for them, but kind of undermines almost like that people go through this every day. And then I liked that the young boy who didn't have a learning disability, Kit, he said like, we learned about this all in context of school, but imagine how hard it must be just like in someone's everyday life. Like right now I'm also in like a literacy class talking about English language learners, and I think about that all the time. Like if I'm in a foreign country, then if there's no signs in English, then like I'm lost. And if I have a learning disability and I don't have like the best reading comprehension, then just like not even going to school, but just like going about your normal day, like finding the bathroom is like, wow, it's hard to imagine. So yeah, I think in my second response, I'm going to write about how a lot of the topics talked about today in this video can be related to being culturally responsive, and how not only these topics relate to children with learning disabilities, but also children that are culturally diverse. Oh, and another critique I had of this video is that it's called F.A.T, frustration, anxiety, and tension. They really only truly talk about anxiety. The frustration and tension are kind of like implied topics, but I think he could have better articulated the tension that he was creating as like the teacher or the facilitator and the students, because there was a lot of frustration and tension there that maybe wasn't, he would address it, but he didn't really talk about it in terms of that acronym F.A.T. So yeah, overall I liked it, but I had a couple of thoughts.